Jordan, tell me, first of all, because many will know you, but many won't. And just give me a sense of who you are, where you're coming in from, because we want to speak about the war in Ukraine and various things that it gives rise to, thoughts and prophecies even. But yeah, just to get a kind of anchor before we fly too far away, just a little bit about yourself and where you are, first of all.
Well, geologically, I'm in Southern California, and temporally, I'm currently in Monday, March 7th, 2022. Yeah, that's right, man. The years are getting very, very tricky to hold on to.
Right.
I suppose probably the most relevant piece to sort of orient is, for a long time now, like 15 or so years, I've been very much working on the inquiry that I suppose in your universe is called the meta-crisis, and it's a very fine name. First, the discernment of, oh shit, we're in a meta-crisis, and then, okay, what does that actually mean? What are the implications, or what are the generator functions that's actually causing us to be in a meta-crisis? And then what's the model that might allow us to actually grasp what the sort of the implications are and the trajectories. And then finally, what might be something like what a resolution to a meta-crisis or the meta-crisis, or in fact, meta-crises in general could look like. And then finally, the practical application of that model. And the last part has sort of been my primary focus now for the past, since about 2018.
Right.
So a pretty decent amount of time now in the applied piece. And, you know, each one of those phases, the way I named it, was kind of the developmental arc, right? So I entered into it having been, I guess, originally a tech entrepreneur. And so I started several tech, internet, digital media companies back in the late 90s and early aughts. And then retired to a life of dissolution and what is that called when you are not very good at anything, but you do lots of different kinds of things?
Well, there are many terms for it. Jack of all trades, but I mean, you can
even less valorous.
Right.
But with a real focus on this whole
professional dilettante, maybe.
Pardon? Dilettante, yes.
Professional, yeah, but I mean,
dilettante, yes.
But I mean, just before, like, because I mean, the reason I asked this, Jordan, is that, you know, I although this is the first time we've actually spoken, you know, we share a certain number of network connections, and I sort of recognize your work as being part of a broader ecosystem of which I'm a part too. And it's a strange kind of place. It's full of people who are, often they've achieved a great deal in a certain conventional context and then remove themselves from it. And in your case, I believe, you know, although you might be doing creative things behind the scenes and maybe, you know, you speak modestly of what you're up to, but at the same time, you know, the background does include, for example, doing what was it, a JD at Harvard or something? And then maybe, back in the day.
JD magna cum laude with, by the way, the current Supreme Court nominee was in the class just before me. So
okay.
I'm now officially old. Okay.
And then a certain amount of time making some good decisions in the tech world. And then you've also, over the years, you know, met with people like Daniel Schmachtenberger and Forrest Landry and spoken their kind of language. I've also seen you on Rebel Wisdom a lot, doing the kind of deep code analysis and laterally Web 3.0. So just before we get into the war and all that, I just want people to know that, you know, there is a history, there is a person. I believe you're also a father. You know, there's a real life there. It's not just a talking head.
Right. Yeah, I'm very much a father. I would say it's my primary vocation is being a father.
Right.
I wouldn't say I'm particularly good at it, but at least it's something I keep trying.
Yeah, I like the idea of good enough parent. I find it gets me through the difficult days. It's like, you know,
yeah, right.
Forgive yourself for being good enough.
We're all works in progress.
Right. So we came to this call, Jordan, partly because we were tweeting at each other, which happens sometimes, but at quite high stakes in some ways, talking about existential matters of not just strategic decisions in Ukraine, but, you know, given the stakes there, potentially nuclear war and how, you know, how best to avert it, and the fact that we should try to avert it, of course. But you and I also share this broader context you just alluded to of the meta crisis writ large, which is that this conundrum in Ukraine comes along, and it comes along. You've probably been thinking a great deal about what a viable Web 3.0 might look like, what exactly DAOs are and how they can help us. I've been thinking quite a lot about the climate and ecological collapse, and working with Zach a little bit on what it would mean to tackle that educationally over a period of decades, getting beyond the limited time horizon of policy and politics. You were or maybe still are to some extent part of the Game B world. I've sometimes been called meta modern. So there's a kind of cross currents going on, but the sort of this tension in the conversation, the creative good tension was, I was suggesting maybe there should be a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Risky though it is, I was open to the possibility, by no means committing. I'm lucky that it's not my decision to make. And you were quite forcefully saying, I don't think I would do that. And for good reason, I suspect. So I suppose just before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, given that I've shared a sense of where we're coming from, when the war broke, you wrote this Substack piece that I read, which was actually quite quintessentially Jordan, if I may say so, because I think one of the things you have maybe more than others in our kind of network is a quality of sort of dispassionate analysis, that almost amoral, if I may say so at sometimes. So there's a kind of capacity to see things completely without investing emotionally or spiritually in a particular point of view or how things should be. You're just saying this is how it looks to be, how it is. And that can be a bit disorienting for the reader. It's like, what is he really like? He's saying this is what's happening, but what does he feel should happen? And so two things there for you. One is reiterate your sense of that analysis, please, but also beyond what you think is happening, do you have a feeling of what you'd like to see happen, or how it might turn out not so bad, or something like that?
In the context of Ukraine specifically?
Yeah, Ukraine, which of course is part of a broader context. Yeah. All
right. Yeah. So a few things to contextualize. As I mentioned in that Substack, and I think the caveat is crucial, the particular piece that I wrote about, let me say this even more fundamentally, in this moment right now, you and I are speaking, right? And we're largely, although not exclusively, using language to communicate, which means that we're trying to compress a certain amount of complex information by means of a relatively bandwidth limited and strictly linear communications medium, right? So we're doing a projection, and a very, very, very low fidelity projection of whatever is actually behind it. In the context of this particular Substack piece, right, I'm writing some number of words, I don't remember however many, for an arbitrary audience, right? So it can't even rely on shared frames or background or context. And what I'll oftentimes do, in fact, by definition, I'm limited to do, is bring out one particular piece of what, of course, is a much larger conception that seems to not be present in the conversation, or at least isn't present to a level that seems to me to be would be healthy for the larger consideration. So what I noticed is that as I was contemplating the story of what was happening in Ukraine, and beginning the process of gathering a wide variety of different models and frames, and I'll maybe caveat to that back in a second, this particular one popped up as being something that seemed more relevant than its presence in the larger conversation, right? So it's like sort of one of many, many, many different frames and models that I had begun to suss out. It seemed more likely than most, though not necessarily in a dominant fashion. I think at the time it was sort of in the 20 to 30%, if I was sort of roughly gathering. So you have like a very flat, because this is a complex environment with so many unknowns. It's a very broad, flat plane of many, many different frames. It's very difficult. Like the error bars on what's confidence intervals are very wide. True. The amount of confidence is very low. So it's like a noise. Yourself
30% confidence, I think you said in your piece.
Yeah, so that was like, okay, this has started to show up as it's quite likely that there's something of this that is part of the bigger story. There's something going on, although, again, that's still not that high. So that's important, right? And so the next piece, and the notion of like dispassionate, it is in fact the case that I developmentally grew up in a context where I spent a very large amount of time operating in the objective mode, right? I played most kinds of games of all sorts, all kinds of games. Right. And when I was engaging in tech entrepreneurship, I was deploying that developmental capacity in that environment. So operating it again is a dispassionate process.
Right.
And so my basic mode is actually very much one of gathering. So I'll try to sort of be in a very dispassionate fashion and very aware of the axiomatics that are underlying a given frame.
Mm-hmm.
So not operating from an unconscious set of axiomatics, but actually saying, okay, if I assume these axioms, what set of frames now emerge as being potentially valid pattern recognitions of the environment, but may in fact be biased by the underlying axioms. So let me try flipping to a different set of axioms. And one of the modalities, and so over my life, I've gathered some very large toolkit of approaches.
Right.
One of the approaches is this notion of an empathic approach, which is the one that drove that Substack speed. So I said, okay, let me just flip. Let me just drop into being as much Putin as I can be. And of course, I'm making assumptions because I don't know the guy very much at all. So I'm have to just sort of pretend and play. Yeah. But by reading some of the pieces, watching videos over periods of time, by the way, like longitudinally, watching videos from the 80s and 90s, not just recently.
Right.
Largely not reading derivative articles because those are, for a world leader, tend to be almost entirely projection or propaganda, like manipulation. Right. But primary sources. And then, okay, settling in that, saying, okay, what might be a way that this particular psychology with these backgrounds and completely different values and perspectives is perceiving this problem? And I was like, okay, this seems like a plausible story. Let me put that out there. So that's the whole process. And by definition, of course, to do something like that, one has to be sort of not just dispassionate, but ultra passionate. Right? Needs to be actually feeling it through the embodiment of Putin, not through the embodiment of Jordan, because otherwise I'm completely manipulating the entire process. It's not useful.
Which was the word you used there? Ultra passionate. What was the word? Ultra passionate. Okay, got it. Yeah, like you're becoming an alter ego, but they are that alter ego or something like that.
Yeah, and feeling it as much as possible from that first person, as much as possible.
Okay.
Then once that kind of gathering process is in place, then okay, what might be a proper way to even think about this problem? All right. So then we get into our tweets back and forth, which was the thing that most, I'll say it alarmed. It was actually an alarm. Was actually the frame, not the content. Right. And it was the last line. And it was actually the video, right? Because what happened was I saw your tweet, and the way I generally do it is if I see a tweet that's a super tweet or whatever it is, a quote tweet.
Yeah.
I'll see the other tweet, right? So I saw the video and I watched the video and I felt the video. That's what was happening. I was feeling the video and a very alarming frame. Like, okay, shoot. Then I read your tweet and I saw, at least at the time, and of course I may have been projecting the emotional state of me on your tweet, but nonetheless felt the frame. I was like, okay, this frame is challenging. This is a really problematic frame. So let me pull that forward.
Sure.
And so the frame, of course, was we're already in World War III.
Right.
That frame, which I think is a big trouble.
Okay, so we'll come to that in a second, just to let the viewer catch up a little bit. So your Substack piece, which you've just spoken about, the kind of generation of, the substance of it was largely looking at the world through the eyes of Putin, but also to some extent through the eyes of Xi in China.
Xi,
yeah. And then thinking of their collaboration potentially and looking at their assessment of the West as somehow decaying or being unable to respond to them, that it was sort of good time to create a new world order as they've been planning to and hoping to in various ways for a while.
Right.
And your assessment was that this is the basis for their action.
You're right. So I apologize. You asked me about that. I didn't even.
No, don't worry. Just to kind of so that we can catch up.
The key idea there was potentially as a probe, right? That was the key notion.
That's right. Yeah, right. It's like let's see how they respond to this.
There's definitely been a collaboration, both overtly and both potentially. There's been a collaboration between Putin and Xi, both at the level of formal. Yeah. And at the level of just informal aligned interests for a long time, right? De-dollarization, stuff like that's been happening. And the proposition was something like a moment at which a particular probe, like a push into the external environment to test, a hypothesis about the capacity, not just the capacity, but even like the characteristic response of the West. What would it look like given where we are now? So that was so it was a probe, and I think the probe response has been fairly resolute. At least it was maybe perhaps more than they anticipated. But that's hard to know what they anticipated. Yeah,
true. we've parked that for a second. My tweet, just so people understand, so we all come at this from different perspectives. One of my perspectives on this is not so much a kind of post-Cold War dynamic, but still informed by the morphology of the Cold War, in which we've got the primary actors here are NATO and Russia, or the East and the West, if you include China, and if you think more broadly than NATO. I'm also thinking it very much from Ukraine's point of view. I've been there for one thing. I've spent some time. I know some Ukrainians. I was there quite recently, as in 2019, and when I was there, there was an incipient kind of Ukrainian Bildung movement who were trying to build forms of transformative civic and aesthetic education as part of their democratic institution building, very much trying to build a new culture that was independent of, well, free from too much Russian influence. And I also got to see them as people who loved much that we took for granted and were jaded by. The possibility of a good state, for example, a state that could actually be beneficent and wise and, help society. And the possibility of a world order that might actually be stable and keep them as part of that stability. And a sort of love of freedom of a certain kind. And, exactly which kind is kind of a political theory question, but certainly the capacity to create your own life, the idea that the individual has some degree of dignity and sovereignty that is not subsumed by the state. Mm-hmm. And so I'm very much coming from that angle. I'm seeing it. So when the journalist speaks in the clip that you mentioned, she's expressing a great deal of emotion about, look, there's a kind of slaughter going on here. It's happening on your doorstep. What will it take for you to intervene with commensurate force, right? Now, saying that, that's what I'm responding to emotionally. Intellectually, I get that the stakes are exceedingly high. They couldn't really be higher, in the sense that were you to do something that looked like it was a provocation, the chance of Russia using a nuclear weapon goes up enough to be alarming. It may not happen, but the probability increases enough that you've created a game-changing risk, a game-ending potentially risk. So it's not that I'm unaware that to propose something that would look like provocation to Russia is potentially foolhardy, unwise. And the way I framed it was, would I do it? And what I'm really asking there is, I'm responding to Ukraine as Ukraine. I'm thinking, look, what do we feel about, rather than just this kind of geopolitical football that's caught between East and West, NATO and Russia, when you actually feel into the people of Ukraine in the way that you would feel into ethically an individual's needs and rights, rather than thinking purely consequentially, the picture looks a bit different. Now, there's no reason to exterminate the world, of course, and one should be judicious about such things. But that's what was calling me forth to say, look, we should consider this. They really are being slaughtered by what looks increasingly like someone who might be psychotic, might just be evil. We don't know the extent. Might just be hyper strategic and forceful. But that's where I'm coming from. It's one of, we should consider this possibility because what's happening is deeply horrific. And if this doesn't provoke us to act, then we have to think of what more would have to happen for that to be the case.
Well, this is, so one of the things that I actually did intentionally right prior to that, it's interesting, I think I actually tweeted it even the day before, was, again, this is sort of from my toolkit. By the way, temporally, my Substack thing, I think, came out like 3 or 4 days before your tweet.
Yeah.
Things are moving quickly.
A lot's happened. Yeah, sure.
Was I noticed that my own mind, and I think many people's had become very focused on this particular event.
Right.
One of the things I do as a practice is I unfocus. When I notice there's a hyper focus, I practice intentionally
zooming out. Right.
Yeah. And when I did that, one of the things I saw was Afghanistan, which you may recall.
Right.
And what was going on in Kabul at the very day that Russia was going into Ukraine.
Yeah.
And I imagine I didn't actually physically visit Afghanistan, but many of my friends who were in the military did. the Afghan people, particularly the citizens of Kabul,
Right.
had also had a certain sense of opportunity and possibility in the kind of the presentation layer of what the West would like to present as being what we're actually about. And were, I think, well, I would say with a very high degree of confidence, highly demoralized by the reality that wasn't going to be the case. And now, of course, they're being rounded up and slaughtered by the Taliban. So this brought to my mind two things. One is, yes, this shit's going on all over the place, and it's a tragedy that we live in a deeply tragic world. It's intrinsically tragic in very, very important ways, and we tend to make it vastly more so. And it's going to get much, much worse, by the way, from my point of view, right? The notion of metacrisis is that where intensity is increasing, the modality of the intensity is different, right? The COVID had a certain quality of crisis and an intensity of a sort. Ukraine has a different quality of crisis and an intensity of a sort, right? And they're sort of all happening as part of a boiling process. So that's one piece. It's sort of like, okay, that's reality. Then the second is to sort of like hold the question of not just, I might call like the consequences in an upward direction. And so a certain set of actions we might take might lead to, let's say, for example, in this case, escalation, linearly, like it might lead to an increase in intensity. But I would also think about things like the diversity of unintended consequences and the probability of unintended consequences, given our competence, our understanding, and the complexity of the environment that we're operating in. And so it's a sort of a general model. And again, to use Afghanistan as an example, ostensibly at least, and by the way, let me back up even one more step. Let me back up and come back in. So we have a notion of intent, right? So you and I both share, I assure you, the intent that to find a way to generate active peace for the Ukrainians, and by the way, for all humans, is not just a primary value, but I would also say a requisite characteristic of any possible future. So I'm not saying this because at sort of an aesthetic, emotional level, I like peace. I'm saying it at a very cold-blooded level. If we don't achieve active peace, we're fucked in a finite time. And by finite, I mean like one relevant to our children. So I'm deadly serious about it. And now, step back. So we share that intent. It's not clear to me that everybody shares that intent. As we posited, Putin may in fact be just straight up psychotic, or he may be troubled, who knows? Or he may just be extremely cold-blooded and very narrow interested. And there's all kinds of possibilities. But if we take a look at Afghanistan, just to kind of like shift the frame slightly, the majority of Americans, I would say, had good intent when it came to the American intervention in Afghanistan. We were largely convinced that the intervention in Afghanistan was both actually well intended by the United States as a kind of a political entity, and would in fact result in positive outcomes. Right? We would protect American lives, and we would sort of restore the Afghan people from the depredations of the Taliban. Now, two caveats there. One is not everybody was. There was a lot of people who were in it for money, a lot of people who were in it for power, a lot of people who were in it for distraction, for sure. And the second is, boy, were we stupid. And I don't mean that in a mean way. I mean, we just really didn't grasp the degree to which good intent doesn't necessarily even vaguely lead to the consequences that we intend. All right. So let's switch back to the Ukraine. Same basic story. There are many, many people whose fingers are in this pie. One of the challenges that we have is we actually have no idea exactly whose fingers are in the pie and what their intentions are in any dimension. I hate to say it, but the leadership of the UK is no more intrinsically comprehensively noble than the leadership of the United States. Nor, by the way, of the Ukraine.
Don't we know?
I don't know exactly the ratio of deeply psychotic bad guys in leadership positions across the various governments of the world. And I would imagine that places like Russia and China are slightly higher than places like Belgium. But nonetheless, there's lots of bad guys making bad choices for very selfish reasons across the entire field. So we have to include that. It's part of the story. But the more relevant part of the story that I want to point to is this question of competence, complexity, and information. When you intervene, when you bring your energy and your capacity into a particular event, and you don't actually know what the consequences might be in all kinds of different ways, it's not necessarily wise to do so. Right? Even if you are coming with good intent, and you can take all the examples from ordinary sort of simple folk wisdom. I have in fact run many different scenarios of what different kinds of consequences of the way that the West has responded to the Russian intervention or invasion might play out.
Mhm.
And they're diverse, right? One of the ones that's very, very increasingly likely, and I think substantially scared and seems to be in mainstream consciousness, is the collapse of the Russian state.
Right.
It seems quite plausible. I don't really know exactly how plausible, because again, information is very hard to come by.
Mm-hmm.
Well, information, high quality truth information is very hard to come by. But the collapse of the Russian state is very unlikely to net produce good results in at least the short and medium terms.
Mm-hmm.
It may over the long term. That's very difficult to assess.
Right.
But in the short and medium terms, the likelihood that it increases overall instability across a very large number of dimensions, not the least of which is a complete collapse of nuclear non-proliferation,
right,
is bad news. And so, okay, if we sort of zoom out and say, okay, at the largest scope, we have a very difficult job in front of us as a species,
right,
which is we actually have to navigate our way out of the 21st century.
Yeah.
This is not a foregone conclusion that we make it. In fact, most people perceive it as relatively unlikely.
Right. So, I mean, there's a huge amount you said there, starting with the aesthetics of peace, which I thought was interesting, that you're not necessarily drawn to the aesthetics of peace, but rather just it's a precursor or a premise.
I am deeply drawn to the aesthetics of peace, but that's not the Not the whole point. The point is,
but I'm just thinking, but what's interesting you say that, because as you said it, I was reminded of something I wrote a while ago, where when people speak about peace on earth, I confess there's a little part of me that doesn't buy it. In other words, there's a part of me that thinks humans are quite driven to war at some level. Now, it's not to say it's morally excusable or that it's a good idea or anything like that. It's just that the word aesthetics is sort of the active ingredient here, because no doubt the pulse quickens and life becomes imbued with meaning suddenly when war is at stake. It suddenly raises the tenor of everyday existence. So you're living several lives every day. So in that sense, the aesthetics of war are just worth mentioning, even in parenthesis, that there's something to be discussed there about the respective aesthetics. Because when I think of peace, and I don't know what comes to mind for you, but if you think of harps playing and waterfalls flowing and birds singing, it's like, yeah, but you get bored of that pretty quickly. And also, I don't know if you know, but I used to play chess for a living. So I sublimate violence. I was a grandmaster. And so I learned a great deal about, you can't win unless you fully take the opponent's position into account. So I do spend a lot of time thinking, how will this look to Russia, right? It's a big part of how I'm framed. And also, I spent a year working with the Open Society Foundations. And for my fellowship, I wrote a letter to the human rights movement, where I was basically saying liberalism hasn't served us that well. I was sort of arguing that to the liberal high church, saying, look, you need to rethink, climate change happened on your watch. You are naive about the good intentions of many actors in the world. The human rights discourse will not penetrate into Russia and China in the way you hope it will. And what then? What are we going to do, right? So a bit like you, insofar as I read the position, to use that metaphor, it's not quite forced checkmate. It's not as though the end is nigh, but the world is quite close to being strategically lost, in terms of how I see the position. The multiple converging problems. Right. Multiple converging problems.
The metaphor there is, I think, quite strong. Yeah.
Right. It's just, the ecological meets technological meets political meets economic meets failure of governance on a grand scale. And it's looking quite challenging. So I think we probably, although I'm sure there'll be differences, the general sense of the prognosis for civilization as a whole being by no means hopeless, but by no means good, is shared.
Right. So good context. That's the context in which I operate.
Yeah.
And in which I perceive what's happening in the Ukraine and Afghanistan. And by the way, Ethiopia, Egypt, if you're tracking what's going on there.
Yeah. And by the way, Afghanistan really hit me in the gut quite hard, because the reason is it's something about the age, and the same with you, but I remembered vividly where I was when we went into Afghanistan. And then it was like almost exactly 20 years later. And like okay, some good things happen in the meantime, maybe there, but there was a sense of this utter defeat despite all of the blood and money that went in there. So it just left me thinking, we don't have a clue what we're trying to do. You know, there was a sense of like disillusion, to put it mildly.
Right, right. So if you hold it something like that, it's like, okay, look, the stakes are literally as high as it's possible for human beings to conceive of. Right? It's funny to say it that way, but you know,
yeah. And maybe even the whole universe, right? We don't even know we're not the only.
Right. In principle, the highest possible stakes in the entire universe, as far as we know.
Yeah.
Well, at least as far as you and I know. There may be other people who know better. At the threshold between mythos and theos, right? Somewhere in that zone, which is a pretty intense zone.
Right. That's a nice.
And the evidence of our competence is disheartening, right? The evidence of our competence is the fact we don't really have a clue.
Right.
Okay. So there we are. That's where we are.
Right.
Back to dispassionate analysis.
Right.
That's
and then Ukraine happens, right? So this is the thing. The Meta crisis was bad enough, right? without the incipient threat of World War III heightening. It was always there, I guess. But
always there, of course. It's part of the Meta crisis, like steady state. Yeah. So this is my focus on that frame. So one of the rules is something like the frame that you are operating under plays a significant role in the future that you actually produce, right? Very straightforward. It's not dispositive, right? As you say, the fact that you really, really convince yourself that you're going to win, even though you're in forced checkmate, doesn't mean you're not in forced checkmate. Reality trumps narrative, but narrative plays a role. So to be very careful in the narratives that we're operating under. And so the thing that alarmed me most initially was the narrative that was being presented that we're already in World War III.
So I qualify that because I think there's a case.
Not for you, for her. She said it. She said it very specifically.
Yeah, but she's not the only one, I should say. Like, it's a slightly more sophisticated claim than it might first appear. I've even heard Daniel Schmachtenberger mention this in passing, not necessarily approvingly, but just acknowledging that the language is out there. The claim is that World War III will be different in kind, just as we say that if aliens really were to invade Earth, they wouldn't take the form of little green men, right? It would be something that we may not be able to perceive with our senses. It might be informational in some sense, like it wouldn't be what we expect. In the same way, World War III, the claim is, and Fiona Hill is one source here, she's worked on national security for years, that it takes the form of disinformation at a vast scale, and disinformation giving rise in time to forms of active warfare. And that it's been underway, she thinks, since about 2014 when the invasion of Crimea began. And the claim is that the disinformation is spreading. January 6th in the US was a site of World War III. Brexit was a site of World War III. Ukraine is a site of World War III. Afghanistan, that's a bit more complicated. But that's the nature of the claim. It's some combination of the power of this, that we don't understand quite how destructive disinformation can be and how it can lead directly to warfare. Even now, my sense of this war is just the epistemic pain of sensing that these people are in different realities. You see these increasingly fascist images from Russia where they're convinced of their rightness because the information they're fed is that they're doing a just thing. And it's kind of tragic because there is a
I'd like to take it.
Sure, just the last point, there is a non-perspectival truth as well, arguably, but there's so many perspectives on the truth that by itself is the scope for democratic disagreement and coming to some common understanding. But channeled through technology of disinformation, it can lead to World War III inexorably. That's kind of the claim, and it's already underway.
Right. So I'd like to take it up 2 notches then. So I think that's like a nice step up from what I might call like a simple World War II projection narrative, right? So the notion that World War III is kind of like World War II, but now.
No, yeah.
Right. I would say obviously not, but I'm actually going to say that particular frame is also not quite there. It's getting in the right direction, but it's close. Because if you take the input of the premise that information war and psyops is a primary modality of the current war fighting technique, you have to make 2 more moves. One move is you have to run a simulation on that, or hypothesis of what are the implications of that taken to a level of sophistication. Because one of the characteristics of that particular warfighting technique is that it obfuscates our capacity to perceive it as a warfighting technique. So if we assume that there is in fact competence in that modality, then we have to also assume that we aren't actually accurately perceiving its presence in the world that we're operating in.
But if it was a really worth thing, you wouldn't know it, sort of thing, right? By
definition, right? We can actually logically conclude that that must be the case. And in fact, begin to say, okay, shit, that has really serious implications for the operating environment that we're in, right? The ability to trust our conclusions becomes very challenging. Now we have to even take it further. What is the substrate? And the way I termed it is I termed it the war on sense making. I want to kind of move away from the 1, 2, 3 narrative. A war on sense making. What's the substrate, or what is the subject of a war on sense making? And it's clearly at the end of the day ultimately not energy,
right?
And it's understanding. It's our capacity in our own psychology and interpersonally to form any form of shared meaning. That's the substrate. That's the thing that at the end of the day it can't help but go after. Now here's a risk. You know, as we know, humans have a really weird, terrible tendency of, again, unintended consequences. And so, for example, we build a nuclear bomb in America, thinking that it gives us an asymmetric advantage, not fully contemplating the fact that somebody else is certainly going to discover it shortly thereafter and change the entire context, right? You know, the people use it against us. Well, one of the problems of engaging in a war on sense making, this is what, you know the character James Jesus Angleton?
I don't think so.
Great name, like it's a perfect name. He was the guy in the kind of the mid 70s and early 80s who was responsible for counterintelligence inside the CIA. Right. So his fundamental responsibility, and this is a time frame, remember, where we had a huge number of scandals. Right. Scandals of KGB agents inside MI6 and all over the place. And they had defectors that were maybe pseudo defectors, all kinds of stuff. And this is also, by the way, when the CIA was doing things like dosing each other with LSD because they were they're trying to figure out how that worked. This is a crazy time. Well, one of the things about him as a metaphor, I used him in the essay on war on sense making I wrote years ago, was he lost his mind. He went nuts. Why did he go nuts? Well, when you're running the war on sense making and you keep recursing the degree to which your own mental models, even your language, like you use the word fascism. Well, the word fascism doesn't mean anything anymore. It's a hopelessly complicated object of war. It has been now made a weapon. It's fully weaponized with all kinds of crazy barbs and consequences and pseudocode and malware that's loaded in it. As soon as you lodge it inside your psyche beneath a certain semantic layer, particularly if you don't understand how to build mental firewalls in your own psyche, you're now the subject of that mode of war. Right. And Angleton, who was one of the first guys to really deal with this, lost his mind. And so the real victim of the war on sense making is our own mind, right? Not even our enemy's mind. It's our own internal capacity. All humans at the end of this war, the true deep war, will lose our capacity to engage in internal and external meaning making and sense making completely. Right? That's the war on sense making when it runs all the way to the end.
Right. Well, there you go. I mean, arguably, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to be too quick to make the comparison, but you know, what you've just described there is something self-terminating by definition, right? It's something
self-fucking terminating. Yeah. Right.
And so that would be maybe one way that so-called World War III would play out.
Right. Now we get to my point.
Right. Good.
How do you protect against that? Well, one thing you have to do is you have to be extremely careful in understanding precisely how mind and communication, meaning making and sense making work at the base level. Like, you have to sort of become a software developer of cognition and understand how to actually construct cognitive structures.
Right, which is metapsychology, right? Of some sort.
As one piece, metapsychology is a major piece for sure. And things like allowing the frame that we're already in World War III to be the frame you're operating in without putting it in a sandbox.
Right.
You're guaranteed to lose, right? You have to actually be able to say, okay, I need to spin up. I'm using computational metaphors because they're a very good metaphor for this kind of thing. I need to actually be able to spin up a sandbox. I need to be able to spin up an instantiation of my own cognition that is not the whole of my cognition. Allow that particular instantiation to run this as a frame and notice what happens inside that sandbox. And if it's safe, then I can migrate that over into my larger self without undue risk. But I need to be very careful and make sure that I'm doing so thoughtfully. Like this is a whole.
But you describe a
real
level
thing.
of epistemic agility there that is beyond most of our capacity, right?
Yes, absolutely, no question. Right. So now to back up to the notion of stakes. When we're endeavoring something like at least as I observe the narrative or the conversation around what's happening in the Ukraine, I really honestly, I don't mean this in a particularly mean way. I very much see that image that was put in my head many years ago of what would happen if you put a box full of hand grenades in a troop of baboons, right? It's very dangerous because they don't know exactly what they're dealing with, but every once in a while their finger's going to get around rings and start pulling them. Right. We're operating at a level where the information environment is itself the subject of a primary war,
right?
Using a highly suspect information environment to steer our choices in the kinetic environment,
right?
Which has intrinsic feedback effects through innumerable scenarios, spin-out scenarios of unintended consequence into escalating kinetic conflict.
Right.
But the information environment itself is completely dysfunctional, meaning right. We don't know how to operate. We don't even know how to operate, and we definitely don't know what how do I say this? What the consequences of what's happening inside this sphere, we don't know. So then we have to say, okay, how do you maneuver? How do you actually maneuver in this context?
But who is the agent here? Is it an individual or is it civilization?
Yeah, this is all right. Okay, great. Good question. The short answer is it is ultimately a new kind of civilization structure is the only viable agent in this context.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you solve the problem by transcending the problem with a different kind of agent.
With a different kind of agent. And then I would point, by the way, that if we can do this, we can't probably do it in real time, but I would argue that's the only, like I said, the only kind that you can't actually do it with the existing civilization structures, which is why COVID was such a cock up.
Right.
It's not because of radical incompetence at the individual level or radical corruption at the individual level. And of course, ordinary levels of incompetence and corruption should be assumed. But the underlying sense-making and choice-making infrastructure available to mid-century institutions was simply inadequate to the level of complexity of the environment they're making choices in. Right? That's all there is to it. It's as simple as that. This is even more so, right? Because now you've got other agents that are operating in conflict models. So we're talking about probably 3 orders of magnitude more complexity, and I don't know, 15 orders of magnitude more consequence. So we're sort of stuck, right? We're actually in a situation where we didn't necessarily intend to be where we are, but we are where we are. Mm-hmm. And we need to be very honest with that. We need to move properly, right? We need to move very deliberately, very carefully, very consciously, and notice that we actually like simple models like blame or disgust. Right. Like we're using our limbic system to make choices here. We're probably going to be pulling a lot of pins like baboons. Right. You can't be doing that. Right. Like we're in the shit right now. This thing needs to be treated with the utmost of care and precision. Right. So the question of
this thing here is the whole thing, right? This is
the whole thing. And by the way, all the way down fractally, right? It's actually what's happening.
Yeah, it's layers. It's one thing that has many things. So it's like
the question of we, I think, is to the point. All right. We is definitely not the governments of the world. Yeah. Because these are all functional institutions that just literally can't respond to the environment that they find themselves in. Yeah. Broadly speaking,
just to clarify, because of their enculturation, because of their incentive structures, because of their legacy institutions, they don't have the capacity to transform.
Right. Let's just take that. So you've got kind of the 3 failings that I tagged under the heading of tainter plus. Right. So one is the intrinsic amount of complexity they can actually process given their organizational structure. Yeah. And there's just an upper limit to what that is. Yeah. And it's below the current threshold. Right. The second is the degree to which they've actually already deployed their evolutionary potential to fill a niche. Right. So everything when it's new, it has a certain possibility space. Yeah. As it goes through its developmental environment, it becomes what it is. So they are actually they are senescent. These are not brand new. These are old. Right. The third is the degree to which they have been gamed and parasitized by the external environment that takes advantage of the ability to take local selective advantage out of global optima. Right. All 3 are present. All 3 are present in spades, and the operating environment is now becoming more and more complex rapidly. Right. So they were over their head. 2014 is as good a time as any. Right. They're certainly way over their head now. Right. So that's a key takeaway. which is a fucking pain in the ass, right? Because you're like, shit, I've got a bad guy who's got tanks and airplanes and he's like really doing super bad stuff. And I want to respond to him. And you're telling me that the thing I would respond to him with is in fact going to make things worse almost every time. I'm saying, yes, that's actually where we are. We're in a situation where if we endeavor to execute on the agentic structures that we developed, more or less, certainly, like I would say 85 to 90% confidence, the consequences, unintended consequences of our actions, we'll say, put it two ways. The intended consequences of our actions will fall far short of our intentions.
Right.
And the unintended consequences of our actions will be both more diverse and more intense than we would be willing to accept if we really were to internalize them.
Okay, and can I just probe, just as a bit of a footnote, inaction is also a kind of action, right? So how do you feel about, because there's the way you're describing it, it's like almost anything we do will go wrong, but does that include doing nothing?
Right. Well, okay, so remember, to come back, the question that was, right, like the hot question was we, who is we? And so, and this is very powerful, by the way. Let me see if I can figure out how to say it just right. And we, if I say we, there's actually two things that are superimposed. Mm-hmm. One over here, the one that I was just berating for its senescence, is the institutional formal manifestation of we, the way that our individual human choices are constrained by a series of designs into formal structures. Yeah. The other we is the actual us, like the actual humans, right? That aren't even named, right? So there's
we're not really a we yet. We're a pre-we somehow. Right.
We're a proto we.
We're
a stem cell, something like that, which is the human nature, right? The human nature is that we aren't in fact a niche organism. We're a niche transition organism that can develop
as well.
And niche creation in a massive way, right? Both. So this is a subsidiary of the former. Once you become niche transitioning, then niche creation becomes available and adjacent possible as a master strategy, right? If nothing else can transition niches like you can, then the very first thing you do is say, fuck it, now niches are changing, motherfucker, because I can beat anybody at that game.
Right.
It's like super chess. We're playing chess. No, now we're flying fighter planes.
Right.
Good luck, Kasparov.
Yeah. Well, I mean, sorry, I didn't want to cut you off, but it's just what you just said reminded me of. There's kind of a simple conceptual structure, but it's quite useful. It comes from Hansi Freinacht, and he just says that, look, there's three broad approaches to things. There's a kind of game acceptance, game denial, or game change. And what he means by that is, if a game is something with rules and aims and players, the broadly conservative approach in the conventional political terms is, this is as good as it gets. We tinker the best we can. That's kind of game acceptance. Game denial is something more like, everyone will become good. We can all play nicely. There'll never be incommensurate values or competing interests. We can find a way to get towards, tinker towards utopia and create a great heaven on earth. But game change says, look, no, our problem cannot be solved. A bit like you were saying, vis-a-vis whether it's the agentic structure or the institutional legacies or human nature as it currently manifests, or our capacity to collaborate as it currently is, or our technologies and the way it mediates those things. They are such that we have to change those games. The game has to be changed in order to survive. And so, broadly speaking, a lot of the modern political world is a battle between game denial and game acceptance, like, conservative, liberal, broadly speaking. But the game change people, the kind of liminal web people that a lot of us are part of, we often sound a bit nebulous, like we don't really know what we're doing, but that's partly because we're trying not to play that game. We're trying to create a new game. And that's not exactly game B, which is another conversation, but it's something like that. It's similar. It's similar. Yeah, it's quite similar. Yeah.
Well, the point of game B is something like, look, if you're going to be engaging in game change, I believe it's the who, right? Say hello to the new boss, same as the old boss, like take that to mind.
Right.
If you're really going to be taking, like if you're going to do game change, that's a big risk.
Yeah.
And most of the time you're wrong, and most of the time, therefore, you're going to lose in a big way. So you better be very careful. And by the way, you should at least make sure that you're actually changing the fucking game. Like it doesn't do a whole lot of good to simply move the pieces around and still be playing the old game. That didn't do anything.
Sure.
The point of game B is like, okay, what does that mean? What does it really mean to contemplate what is the game? What's the game? What's the actual game that we're trying to change?
Right.
What is its characteristics down to a very, very precise level of reification and clarity so that we can be very, very sure that when we're changing.
Sure.
Yeah. That's kind of the absolute most cutting edge of that frame is just that simplicity.
Right. So I mentioned that now because of where you were, because it's like you're about to sort of point towards, I hope.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a we that is basically in a game. Then there's the we as the ones that play games are not necessarily in any game. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when I can say that, I say, for example, there are no Russians and there are no Ukrainians.
Right.
They're humans.
Sure.
All right. And they don't even necessarily have names because their languages are part of Russian, Ukrainian, but they're humans who are to a greater or lesser extent currently entrained to cultural and institutional forms that constrain their choices.
Sure.
Mostly to a greater extent, though not exclusively. At the end of the day, we are vastly more human than we are enculturated animals, right? Because we've been human for a very long time.
Sure.
And we're entering into a state, into a new context. So how do we begin to make choices in that fashion? So we're definitely not doing nothing. As you say, ostensibly to intend to do nothing is simply to deny the fact that you're actually always doing something, no matter what. Right. Like I'm buying stuff, I'm eating food, or I'm participating in global capitalism, even if I'm trying to minimize my footprint, right? Even at a base point, right? I'm using the internet. There's all kinds of stuff. I'm doing lots and lots and lots. If I did a full accounting of what I'm doing, it's a whole lot. And so those all have consequences and implications.
Sure.
And overwhelming, right? One of the pieces that happens right there is most people, myself very much included, when you fully grasp the consequences of that and the magnitude of what we have to deal with to be able to actually step away from and change the game, you're overwhelmed instantaneously.
We're completely, we're lost. We are the game in a sense. Yeah.
It's trouble for sure. So what does it mean? So you asked a question earlier. It made me kind of sigh. So it's like, okay, what would it look like for this thing to move in something like a direction where we would say that was of the available real possibilities, a good one? Yeah. By the way, I'm sorry, I hate to say this, but let me step back and just provide a frame, a metaphor. Let's say you've been diagnosed with serious, big-time terminal cancer. Now, and I'm just going to propose for a moment, and there are no miracles for your particular journey. Right? So this is, you're dead. You're dead. It's done. All right. So all the forward paths for you are terminal. There's terminus in a short-term time frame. Let's say a year. You've got a year to live. You're dead. Now you could go into denial if you'd like, and maybe what do I know? There may be a miracle. Let's just for the moment propose there aren't any. So now the challenge is, okay, given your diagnoses, what are the paths that we could say would be good paths? Well, there's a lot of variance in that category. Right? I'm just want to put that as a context because, okay, if we're looking at a real context, we have to actually be very clear with the reality, and we can't deny or be in delusion. What are the good paths for Ukraine? Well, I'm going to say that comprehensive peace tomorrow is very, 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 very unlikely. Okay. And I'm just using that as an example, which is okay.
Yeah.
So we need to start stepping out. God, there's so many things to be thinking about. What we want to catastrophically avoid catastrophe. We'd like to say, okay, begin working backwards and prune really bad ones. There's a lot of really bad ones, by the way. If you take a look at it, like it blows my mind, actually. I have narratives on the one hand using the word genocide, and literally right next to it are citizens in cities engaging in peaceful protest that is actually stopping Russian tanks. Yeah, those aren't compatible, right? One or the other is true, not both. Now, this is clearly not currently a genocide in the Ukraine. In a genocide, the Russian tanks just slaughter all the citizens. There are no citizen protests. That's not how genocide works. This is a very bad situation, but we need to be very careful with our use of language because the word genocide has to mean something real. Otherwise, we can't actually use it to help us guide our choices.
But you can.
The point being, it can get a lot worse.
Yeah, make the point first, and I'll come back to these.
The point being, it can get so much worse. We don't currently have a capacity to comprehend how much worse it can get. But let's not fucking overblow it, right? It's bad, real bad, much worse than we've experienced in our lived generation. Great. It could get a fuck ton worse. It's a formal definition. So let's avoid that. Sure. Can we at least just make sure that we don't lead it down past
that's the old medical, isn't that the old Latin thing? The doctors, was it primum non nocere or something like that? That first do no harm. Like you find a patient and it's like, whatever you do, don't make the condition worse. That's the first thing.
Right. You find a guy who's on the ground with a broken leg, you don't immediately start stabbing him in the heart. It's not the first thing you do. Yeah.
Or even if they have potential paralysis, you don't move the body, things like that. So yeah, but
maybe the next thing I'd do, by the way, and this seems very odd, but the next thing I do, I fucking breathe. Have you noticed that the the hue and cry of sort of mob mentality is so pervasive, probably not helpful. Mob mentality is characterized as not being an effective way to guide effective choices.
Yeah. No, you lose
Breathe.
for sure.
Hey guys, everybody in the entire world, like for at least 1 second, take a breath. Slow the fuck down. Like, holy shit, this is real trouble. We're not going to make good choices by being insane. We're also, by the way, not going to make good choices by prioritizing our own narcissism over the reality on the ground. Let's be very clear.
No.
So that's like simple stuff, right? Very, very simple stuff. But just those simple things, just by doing a little bit by that, by the way, none of which is going to happen. But if we were to do that, we would decrease the overall risk in the system by probably 2 orders of magnitude. That's actually pretty substantial. It may feel like nothing. It's not. It's wisdom.
Right. But okay, it might be wisdom. But the interesting thing that came to my mind is that the 2 injunctions you offered are directives to the one of the 2 we's, but presumably not to both. So, when you're saying we should breathe, you're speaking to our current political class, I guess, partly.
No, I'm saying humans, every human on the planet.
Right, every human, okay. And then when you're saying, let's not do anything that causes further harm, you're equally speaking to humans qua humans, not humans as encultured political agents, right? So, okay.
Yes.
So I think I understand, and I agree with that, because I agree things can get worse. And in this occasion, really potentially very much worse. On the other hand, this is worth just hearing too. I was describing, some people think of climate change in a sort of apocalyptic terms as gradually the world, literally a couple of months back, the sea was literally on fire for a while because of some oil terminal explosion or whatever. But it was a real image. The sea was actually on fire momentarily somewhere in Mexico.
Yeah.
And then, you also have violent weather more generally. You have all of these sort of scenes that are terrifying. And so it can feel like the apocalypse is coming. And I was speaking to someone who's Jewish, and they just said, look, if you're Jewish, the apocalypse has already happened. And I just add to that, look, if you're Ukrainian, it's already happened. So in a sense, while I agree with you, Jordan, that like dispassionately, objectively, hang on,
it hasn't.
No, but hang on. You're speaking at a different level that I'm speaking. I'm talking really subjectively and to some extent intersubjectively, not objectively, which has its own reality, right? So I'm speaking about people who feel things cannot possibly get worse on the ground. They've just lost their home. They've just seen their children shot. They're starving. They can't find water. They can't walk anymore. They collapse. These kind of people, right? They just can't imagine one of us guys sitting in the comfort of our own homes talking about how things can get worse. For them, It's already happened, right? So I'm trying to think of it from their point of view again. And this is where I mentioned in one of the Twitter exchanges, one thing I find quite interesting on this discussion of warfare especially, is that I think there's a risk of a kind of default consequentialism that makes it the only meta-ethical value, that we only think in terms of the right thing is entirely about consequences and not about anything else that's about something more fundamental, perhaps, about where you would draw the line. There's all of these ethical quandaries, as you probably know, like, would you torture a little child to save 10 people from being killed, or, these kind of things. That's worth bringing to the discussion, because part of what I'm feeling in Ukraine is, no doubt, at a consequential level, if you do a sort of aggregate welfare analysis of 7.9 billion people, no doubt that could go down, and it is likely to in some ways. But I'm also trying to say that's only one level of analysis. There's another that says, if a crazed dictator is in effect slaughtering an innocent population, that's enough to act, and damn the consequences. I'm just curious to know how you think of that. You laugh, but it's not ridiculous.
No.
Yeah,
I'd say it is ridiculous, but it's because of what I was saying in my head. So it's not in our shared space. I don't personally ascribe to or use a consequentialist methodology in my ethics.
Right.
Actually, I mean, it's useful as a tool to sort of gauge certain things, but at the end of the day, it's incoherent. So it's silly to endeavor to do so.
Right.
I would actually.
Would you agree that it's sort of tacit in the discourse? That my sense is not just speaking of you here so much, but the discourse I hear about assessing outcomes is invariably a consequentialist one. And I guess I just want to put a word in for those who would say, you know, something tragic has already happened where we're allowing a population to be slaughtered.
Yes, well, I would sort of make it in 3 steps. The first is, I would say that the vast majority of the discourse isn't considered at all. Right? So the vast majority of the discourse is entirely something outside of the category of considered. Right. I would agree, in fact, that the majority of the discourse that is in fact considered is consequentialist. And then I would propose that from my own point of view, that is actually incoherent, which is bad news, because it shouldn't therefore be the majority of.
Just to explain why you feel that way. I agree broadly, but I'm curious to hear how you put it.
You mean at the baseline?
Well, just, yeah. What is it about consequentialism that's incoherent?
At the end of the day, it's the combinatorial explosion problem.
Which is just, I mean.
Which is that it's impossible in principle. It's basically an extension of Gödel. It's impossible in principle to actually enumerate or calculate the consequences in any degree, first or second or third order, so that the capacity to actually engage in the underlying calculus that is presented as the methodology is actually theoretically impossible.
Okay. Right.
So it's incoherent. I mean that formally. It's formally incoherent as an approach.
Okay, got it.
So let's see. So then, for example, as a simple bias, you notice I actually use the word wisdom. Like let's go back to wisdom. Okay, let's go back to
give me some of that stuff, right?
So the proper response is, okay, let's actually try to embody virtue in all of its various myriad characteristics, and that was actually the next step I was gonna mention. So the next step would be something like, let's just do, like, to imagine this. It's invoke a frame. Let's imagine that there was in fact something like wise, courageous, competent stewards endeavoring to respond to the questions that we're asking. That would actually be the next step. Right. I mean, use a historical analysis, because this is actually, it's nice, this happens. Many times, I want to say every time, but most of the time, when a really serious kinetic, by the way, kinetic has a really nice correlation with evolutionary, meaning it's like things cash out at the kinetic level. You are fit or not fit, ultimately grounded at the level of energy. Right. So when a kinetic conflict emerges, the United States, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, you can film the Franco-Prussian War, right? When that happens, one of the things that typically shows up is a process whereby the sort of dysfunctional institutions and parasitic leadership structures either are shed rapidly, or the ones who don't do that are terminated. Right? So you can take a look at historical analysis, like what happened in France during World War I, like that process of, shit, these guys are idiots and they don't know what they're doing, and or are we call it parasitic. We need to get rid of them. So one of the things we need to be doing right now is we need to actually be finding the individuals who are actually competent with some heuristic. Like I tweeted, why don't we take the guys who actually predicted this fucking thing? If there are a bunch of people who've been calling for this for 15 years, and if any of them are still alive, just maybe ask them, what might they do? Like just as a simple heuristic, if you really, for a long time, well before you got any big paychecks or a lot of celebrity for being on the ball here, demonstrated that you're on the ball here, earnestly and with real commitment, maybe you know something that we should be listening to. How come I haven't heard any of these guys' perspective on what's up? Okay. Contrary-wise, if you're obviously incompetent or corrupt, maybe we should be giving you less energy, like a simple sorting function to orient our choice-making infrastructure towards competence and integrity as a basic function before we're actually delivering major choices. That's actually the proper order. Right? Yeah. Steward towards competence and wisdom and virtue, restore virtue, then make choices in complex, intense environments. Right. And again, the history of war tells us this.
Yeah, I mean, and it does, and I agree equally. Part of the problem is the selection process, which may depend upon democratic mechanisms, which may depend upon sense making, which is broken down.
Good. Right? Good. Okay, now we're really getting there. So we've got a sharp blade. Right? We're willing, for example, to present the possibility of enforcing a no-fly zone in Ukraine. Right? That's the thing that's in the zone. We're willing to consider that.
It's a decision, yeah.
It's a decision, but it's a decision is valid. Right? It's in the zone of we could do it. We may not, but we could.
Yeah.
And we recognize that that presents the possibility of significant escalation at the kinetic global risk level.
Right.
I would like to propose that we also should be willing to consider novel forms of governance.
Right.
We are not bound by our current governance infrastructure.
No.
It is not the case that we have to simply vote for a new senator 3 years from now. We, the we that's back here prior to the game, still fundamentally are A, what's actually real, and B, is the source of all governance.
Right.
If we collectively are like, wow, this thing's fucked, we need to actually do a better job,
right,
we could solve that problem if we chose to.
We is worthy of the term, as in the collective, latent collective capacity is actualized.
I'm going to tell you, so I'm going to jump to the end. The meta crisis is going to continue to pound us until we figure that out.
Right. So, I mean, for what it's worth, I wrote an essay called The Impossible We ? Because it's exactly where I've alighted on that question.
Good.
And it
that's a good title.
Right. And it came about because I was getting a bit tired of the broadly progressive communities I was part of, speaking of the we that had to do X, Y, and Z without stating what this we was and how it was going to arise.
Yes.
The we that I witnessed was the same we that screwed up in Afghanistan, that's now invading Ukraine.
Fill in the blank. Yeah. You know, has boggled everything meaningful for quite some time. Like as long back as I can remember, more or less. Right. I mean, I'll give them credit where credit is due, but it's not much due very often.
But do you agree with me? But vis-a-vis your intuitions about this, do you agree with me that the pre-political we, if you like, or maybe that's not the right way of putting it, the latent we, the proto-we, the we of our better natures, both individually and when they're combined, there is some source of hope there, in the sense humans qua humans are not necessarily the problem. It's humans vis-a-vis existing political, cultural infrastructure and historical forces that have shaped them that are the problem, right?
Right. Yeah, very much so. And I will even say practically, so I've been operating under this as the primary hypothesis for some time. And I was observing the early COVID period very closely, because the relative slowness of the uptake and action of the formal we, right, the captured institutional we, sort of in the February, March, April timeframe,
right,
we saw the spontaneous self-organization of the proto-we beginning to happen.
Right.
And it was happening rapidly. I was tracking it day to day, saying, okay, what's the sort of the amount of people, what's the orientation, what's the process of discovering new governance mechanisms. Right. And to be perfectly honest, if the formal we had just done nothing for like 3 or 4 more months, the proto-we would have achieved a level of organization that would have been like decisive in the crisis.
Maybe as well, right?
Right, catalytic for the meta crisis.
Right.
Right. So I'm not joking. Like we only have so many opportunities left to us, because each time a new pulse of intensity hits, it creates more and more instability across the larger system, as we're seeing, right? Gas prices and food prices, and that's going to have cascading effects in every direction. And so, you know, the clock continues to tick, and the degree to which we don't actually wake up into this impossible we question mark is the problem. And that's the core problem, the center of the whole thing.
Right.
I'm glad as far as I'm concerned,
agree on that. Yeah, that's because it's a conundrum. It's sort of it's the meta problem, if you like.
That's exactly the right location. It sounds like a joke, but it's not. It's actually formally true.
Yeah.
Okay. John Vervaeke and I spoke about it in terms of the it's the meta generator function, right? It's the generator function that constrains and gives rise to the generator functions that actually develop the specifics that implement in particular domains, right? That's like, that sounds like a lot of words, but if you actually slow it down,
I know what you mean. And I also came to the view that weirdly the world's problems are ultimately problems of grammar. And by that, I mean, semiotic creatures, we have to mobilize injunctions using the pronouns we have available. So we do constantly say we need to do this and we need to do that, but we're terminally deluded in that process, because we're not actually saying with sufficient clarity what has to happen. Until we can get a richer repertoire of we-ness, we won't really know what we're saying to each other.
Quite. Yeah. And so we can actually be tactical. It's useful at this point to someone be tactical, or even diagnostic and prognostic. Because we're not, how do I say this? We're sort of not all at once waking up to this moment going, oh, fuck, we have to actually do this thing. We have no idea. And in fact, we have a lot. There's a lot. Yeah. So I'll give you an example. The example is a little bit ironic. I sometimes refer to it as the reverse Tower of Babel problem.
Right. Right.
We have to be increase our skillfulness
right.
at communication with each other.
Right.
It's a whole toolkit.
Yep.
Things like disambiguation and mapping awareness. You know, the notion of you just said we.
Yeah.
A little confusing. I feel like we're not connecting just yet. Can we slow down and back up? What did you mean? Oh, the word we here has at least two very distinct meanings. Neat. Yeah. Now we can move forward. Like that level of skillfulness and communication is a big piece of the work we have to do. Fair enough. I've talked about this thing that I call the sovereignty, but many people call it different things. And other people besides me also use the word sovereignty in this certain way, which is things like an individual awareness of stuff like your own emotional and cognitive biases and various internal frames and habits and typology, like an awareness of your own interior and a attunement of that to actually skillfully enter into interpersonal communication. Right? So there's the individual attunement, and then there's the collective attunement, and getting those two things tuned up so we can actually begin the process of forming this new kind of we. So then the third, Jamie Wheel and I talked about this actually once, which was the urgent, I think his name's James Bond. That caught the scene, right? The scene where the nuclear bomb, in point of fact, is on the timer and the clock is ticking and the number is going down rapidly. And there he is, by the way, wearing a tuxedo, probably holding a martini and a woman.
Shaken, not stirred. Yeah.
Getting ready to be vaporized, not stirred. Right. But quite calm, cool, and collected, defusing the bomb.
Right.
And the metaphor is, I think, quite nice, because the urgency problem is one where you say, okay, well, there is in fact a real urgency. I'm not denying the fact that there's an urgency. There is an urgency at a very practical level. There's an urgency to the people on the ground in the Ukraine, and there's an urgency at the meta-practical level, like the clock's ticking for the whole species. Both are true.
Yeah,
clocks. But the problem with the urgency problem is that if you get rattled by the fact of the urgency, then you're definitely fucked. You have to actually be able to maintain the level of composure to actually deal with the real problem, knowing that there's urgency.
I've always thought the injunction to take your time was wonderfully. We didn't appreciate just how deliciously ambiguous it is, because we always assume that take your time means go slow, but actually it just means assess how much time you have and act wisely. Really. Right.
Yeah. Move at the pace of the time you have.
Yeah.
The Marines phrase of slow is smooth, smooth is fast is a very nice koan.
That's right. Yeah. And I suppose in the moment when Ukraine is sort of unfolding very rapidly, and there is the broader context of the big meta crisis, and then there's the meta crisis. It's difficult for anyone to know how to act. I suppose what I'd like a somewhat better sense of from you is, you know, we could potentially agree on transcendental design principles about what humanity has to do, and that might include, you know, it might include don't make things worse. For one, take a breath, find wisdom. Right? Let's imagine we could agree on all that. And when I say we here, I mean absolutely everyone. Right? Do you think it's possible that there could then be a viable next step that would actually work? Because even if you achieve that gargantuan achievement, right? Even if you get everyone to agree on what needs to be done, then the how arises, right?
Oh yes, absolutely. I would say with certainty.
Right.
Weirdly enough. And work, by the way, at every level of analysis. Now we have to be very careful what we mean by that.
Right.
And what we mean is to navigate. I'm going to use kind of an odd language.
Or use Ukraine as an example also if you want, but.
To navigate towards the timelines, right, to the scenarios that are the ones that we would most prefer, that are in fact available.
Right.
And this is that notion of like maybe a game change, and also to provide a trophic cascade, which is to say we're actually unlocking or opening entirely new possibilities that are not yet currently available. Right. That's what we really want to start doing. We actually want to migrate in the field of adjacent possibles, right? We want to migrate to an adjacent possible, but we actually want to migrate to an adjacent possible that actually opens up the field of adjacent possibles to an even higher peak. Right? We begin the process of traversing along the ridge line to peaks that we can't currently get to.
Right.
Because it's not available, but the next step can open up a new path. That's what we want to do.
Right.
So what's that look like? Oof, so many possibilities.
Right.
Yeah, so many possibilities. I mean, even take a look at something. So I'll back up. One, going back to Ukraine, by the way, let's even close, going all the way back to the notion of no-fly zone.
Okay.
Right? I am not foreclosed to that as being a viable possibility. Right? My primary objections were twofold. First, the frame of we're already in World War III, I'm foreclosed to that because of the aforementioned. Like,
because it becomes an active ingredient in the situation. Yeah.
Exactly. So we have to actually say, okay, the only way that we actually avoid the underlying possibility that we're already inevitably within the event horizon of the singularity event of World War III is to first and foremost consciously choose not to be in that fucking singularity. Like that's what we have to do. Right. And I don't mean delusionally. I think this is a Jamesian truth. We're not in World War III. We're not inevitably in World War III precisely because the essence of that proposition actually is sitting in our psychology.
Well, it could become self-fulfilling, right? That's the essence of it.
It's that kind of thing. It is only that kind of thing. Okay, so that's one. So no fly zone. So one, don't put ourselves in a frame that is a self-fulfilling catastrophe. Two, be making choices from a place at least vaguely in the direction of sanity and wisdom. Mm-hmm. Three, if out of those two you get no fly zone, okay.
Right.
Now, I don't know the complexity on the ground. I don't know the parameter space. I can't foreclose a possibility. I can foreclose a methodology for addressing possibilities.
Right. Okay, that's interesting because I think that's what, were there to be a forum for wise leadership in this kind of context, it would have these underlying principles that people would refer to as a shared reference point to say it doesn't, right. And then you might well converge on an agreement that everyone would feel was.
It does seem like
that's what John would call dialogos, the sense of which something has emerged that wasn't there previously.
It's like, okay, rule one: are you coming from a nihilistic apocalyptic mindset? Yes. Stop.
Yeah. Go that way.
Okay. No. Next. Yeah. Are you completely insane? Yes. Stop. Okay. No. Sure. Okay. At least we're beginning.
One of those diagrams. Yeah. That's curious. Well, we've ended up where we started. But I mean, knowing the place a bit better for the first time.
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah. My sense is we should pause here and maybe speak again at some point. Not too far away, but just that we've probably, I sense we've reached a natural kind of discovery of what we were talking about together. And
Yeah, I agree. I would say that my feeling is I have a sort of a warmth in my heart. I feel a warmth towards you, and I feel also a warmth towards more broadly the world. And I feel also that's a reminder, a pointer towards the right direction. Mm-hmm. That the we is definitely here.
Right.
The we is already present in a very fundamental sense. And our challenge in some sense to allow it to become more present. Right. That direction of warmth of heart is a sign of allowing it and a pointer towards how to get there more, something like that.
Yeah. Well, likewise. And it's been a pleasure, and I hope not the last time. So
that was intense.